Welcome to Security Take Two. I'm Chester Wisniewski, and I'm here with my co-host, Ben Verscharen.
This is episode 6, recorded on the 6th of March 2025, and today we're going to be talking about the TfL hack, or the Transport for London hack that occurred in 2024.
Yeah, it was September 1st of 2024, if I'm not mistaken. At least that was when the breach was first detected, and unlike some of the other episodes, this one's not about ransomware, which is, unfortunately rare in 2025. But as you said, it was more of a data breach, right? I mean, they discovered that data had been accessed. I don't know how they never told how they necessarily detected the intrusion, did they? But when they looked into it, it was clear that somebody had accessed about 5,000 sort codes or bank account details that you might use for transferring money into or out of accounts, and that mostly seemed to be related to people that had asked for refunds from the frequent transit user card in London, which is known as the Oyster card. And if to quote the CTO from Transport for London, it was an attack by very sophisticated and aggressive attackers. And I think that's maybe where we start here.
Yeah, well, firstly, I think every press release indicates that there's some form of sophisticated and aggressive hacker in their network, but the official word was that the IT security teams actually detected suspicious activity on the network, and they feared ransomware initially, but that wasn't the case. So this sophisticated attacker was arrested only 4 days later, and it wasn't a sophisticated attacker after all, but in fact a teenager. But a lot of things happened in between. Like you said, a lot of the payment networks went offline. So, in London, you can tap on or tap off, so to speak, with your credit card. That couldn't happen. You couldn't pay for or top up your Opal card, as you mentioned. But what I found interesting was a lot of the API services for third parties went down. So tools like Dial-A-Ride, which are incredibly important, as well as other tools like Citymapper as well to track live congestion, live transit, all went offline as well. Amazingly though, Chet, the OT network didn't go offline, and the trains and the buses continued to run.
Well, I'm still hung up on this sophisticated and aggressive 17-year-old. I mean, that's not to say that a 17-year-old can't be sophisticated nor aggressive. They certainly can be. But I think this, to me, this is a message to those listening. If you're in charge of communications about your breach, I don't necessarily recommend you say that the person that got into your network is lazy or unsophisticated. But too often we're hearing that the only thing that could possibly have gotten past our security is a sophisticated, aggressive attacker. And we all know that that's not necessarily the case most of the time.
Well, credibility's out the window,
I'm a little annoyed.
Yeah,
I'm a little annoyed with that. I mean, you don't have to admit that you were terrible, but the idea that everything must be a nation state if it was able to overcome our defenses is a little worn out. I feel like I've heard this trope too many times.
Yeah, and let's be honest, with the arrest happening 4 days later, you know that it's not sophisticated. So it really was just to cover it, to make it sound like you're not incompetent, which, there are other ways to communicate that, but typically 17-year-old attackers, and we saw the same thing with the Optus breach that we previously talked about, don't have great operational security, typically stumble across something that, is opportunistic for them and aren't sophisticated. So if I was a victim, and luckily I wasn't in this case, it's been a long time since I've been to London, but if you hear that and say, it's a sophisticated cyber attack, records were accessed, immediately you're like, okay, well, now someone can steal my identity. To then hear that it was a 17-year-old 4 days later, to me then says, well, how many more discrediting or how many more lies were in that initial press release, and how much can I actually trust you?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I mean, the credibility and authenticity is something we're talking about more and more frequently these days. And that initial public response might set the wrong tone, and then it's, even if you're truthful after, it can be hard to live up to. Now, you mentioned how the trains kept running. Fortunately, none of them crashed. Nobody was messing with signals. Nobody was messing with switches. All the things we would worry about in a train network being hacked of any sort, whether it be cargo or passenger. And that's really great news. But it sounds like the IT systems didn't have much segmentation, because like lots and lots of cascading things happened immediately when they seemingly intentionally took everything down to investigate and to protect that corporate network or IT network, as opposed to maybe for listeners that don't live and breathe security the way we do, OT is operational technology as opposed to IT being information technology. And it's a very common thing to separate those systems in a factory or a train network or a chemical plant or these types of things. And it's designed to very much have this outcome, right? Like the idea that the trains kept running on time and safely, despite the fact that these more vulnerable systems with more external connectivity, like direct access to the internet, APIs, these types of things that are exposed where there's more risk, are isolated from the things that could cause a safety concern. So that all worked, which is good. But the impacts were quite widespread. As you mentioned, those APIs being down meant people couldn't access, traffic jam cameras. And the one that really stuck out to me when you and I were preparing for the podcast is dial-a-ride services, which are often used by people with accessibility challenges, were offline for an extended period of time. And that is a massive impact on a lot of people's lives that depend on these services and can't just get around some other way, right? Because one of the other things we didn't mention that were impacted were the discount cards that are offered to students, school-age children, and the elderly that are either discounted or free within the London Transit network. And that's a massive impact on those folks. But, the response from Transport for London was like, well, just pay for all your rides and we'll credit you back later. And we'll get to that later in the story. But for folks using Dial-a-Ride that have accessibility challenges, that's not an option. It's not like we'll get to you later. It's like, I need to go to the doctor and I need to go to the grocery store. And these are serious life impacting services.
Yeah, so just for clarity, because I actually had to look this up myself, Dial-a-Ride is incredible. If you've got any accessibility issues and you need assistance, you can Dial-a-Ride, and essentially a community bus will come to your house and pick you up and take you to where you need to go. So it's hugely valuable for a massive group of people, right? So to have that offline is, yeah, like you said, life impacting. If you can't get groceries and you can't eat because of a cyber incident, it's not where you want to be. It's a bad day. But even for students, I noticed there's a concession style of card, and they were offline as well. You couldn't use your concession card. So then the request was that families just pay for it out of their own pocket, and then at a later date, they will be reimbursed. And, if you're challenged financially and you have to sacrifice, say, getting groceries because you're having to pay £10-20 a day on public transport, that's, again, not a place you want to be.
No, and it was even more complicated than that, because I think early on they were saying like, oh, well, if your card is expired, you'll still be allowed to travel on transit services. We've told all of the bus drivers, etc., like, don't enforce the rules right now because of this crisis. But a lot of people reported it was still being enforced anyway. And on things like the tube, where there's often no actual attendant to appeal to, depending on the time of day and the station you're using, you were forced to get an Oyster card and pay for it. There wasn't any way to flash your card and get through if it was expired, because the system just didn't recognize the expired card. And, I don't think we should go too far in the weeds on what business logic should be in the payment card readers and all this kind of stuff. But I got the impression from many of the public statements from Transport for London that they were downplaying the impact of this because the trains were operating and the buses were operating. And there's a lot to be said for that was not impacted. But I believe in my notes here, I have that over 1 million people had some sort of discounted or comped card from the system because of their inability to pay, or on a needs basis need to access transit at a reduced rate or free. 1 million people's lives were disrupted, and while we haven't gotten to this, I'm going to drop the other shoe now, Ben. Much of this wasn't resolved until early December, more than 90 days after this attack began, and it wasn't completely resolved until February of 2025, only a few weeks before this recording.
Yeah, which again, long time, a lot of people impacted, and even just the stress of like, am I going to get reimbursed? Will I get my money back? Are they going to review it and then say, actually, no, you don't qualify? Uh, that's a long time and impactful for a lot of people. But one thing that I do want to highlight as well, Chet, and this blew my mind, is you mentioned that some of the reports said that some people, like as in bus drivers, were still enforcing expired cards and not letting people on the bus. When your IT systems are down, and it turns out that there's 30,000 employees, uh, distilling that information and getting that out, distributing that to all the bus drivers, to all the train drivers to say, hey, for the time being, for the next week, the next 2 weeks, just let anybody on if they've got an expired card. Like, actual communication is a problem when you've got 30,000 people you need to communicate to. I would dare say that a lot of those bus drivers were probably getting that information and communication from the newspapers, from online social media, and that kind of thing as well. So it's a difficult challenge to overcome, even just critical communications to that many people in a distributed manner.
Well, since you mentioned all those folks, one of the things that they decided to do as part of the incident response was to reset the credentials of all of the employees at TFL. And of course, during the pandemic, many employees at TFL, just like all the rest of us, started working from home when they weren't needed to be physically in the office. Obviously, that doesn't apply to people operating trains and driving buses, but this is, there's a big apparatus that runs something as large as a transit system for the City of London, and many of those people are office workers. And they were all required to go physically in person to a TFL office in order to reset their passwords. Now, like, the security nerd in me says, wow, like that, in a way that's a great practice, because they're like literally made people come and show a photo ID and reset their credential within presumably Active Directory or Entra ID or whatever they're using. But on the other side, it felt a bit heavy-handed to me that one 17-year-old from the West Midlands who was arrested 4 days into this incident, and the response is, well, everybody has to reset their password and come show their photo ID. It felt a bit extreme. And to me, the reason I wanted to raise this is, in my experience in, well, pretty much 30 years of doing information security now, you need to apply an appropriate amount of response or caution or barriers. Security is always a barrier. It always gets in the way of something you want to do. It needs to be proportional to what it is you're accessing, right? Like, if something's highly critical and you have some sort of advanced privileges, certainly if you're an IT administrator, somebody that can do wire transfers in finance, these types of things, I want photo ID. I want to know you are who you are, and I need to make sure you're not a deep fake or whatever. But making every bus driver come in to reset their password and show their photo ID, I don't know. What did you think?
I thought it was insane, if I'm honest with you. Like you said, there are some merits to that security practice, but this was in 2024. Like, if it was 2010, I'd be like, yeah, you know what? They're probably using on-prem Active Directory, aren't federated to the cloud. Password resets are difficult. Let's get everybody in. But with systems like Entra ID now, Okta, or Auth0, like, there are so many OAuth services. There are so many cloud federated identity services. There's better ways to reset 30,000 employees' passwords if you even need to. And I should clarify on that, so that they figured out who it was quite early on. I dare say, as a 17-year-old, when the police kick down your door and say, hey, you're in a lot of trouble, they would be quite forthcoming and hopefully give up exactly what they did in order to reduce their overall sentence. Surely they would have known the impact by that stage and not need to reset 30,000 employees' passwords. But they've gone down that path, they've decided that that's the right way to do it. Tell me that they couldn't go to office.com or login.office.com and do even batched resets of people's passwords, or have people do it online. There are better ways, and there are so many systems to do that now. They're lucky. Transport London's lucky that all of their employees live within the UK. But if this IT team and these IT systems had have been for, say, a global company where employees are scattered all around the world, or even all around a continent, getting them all to go to a site where they can then reset a password is just, it's not something that you would do in modern computing. So I've got a lot of questions about how their IT systems are set up in the first place, because they shouldn't have needed everybody to physically go to a location.
Well, and to me, it says there wasn't a disaster recovery plan that was comprehensive or proportional to what happened, and that they were just throwing out the baby with the bathwater and let's just do it all. I mean, again, with a decent XDR platform widely deployed, you should know exactly what had been accessed. And you wouldn't necessarily need to require all staff members to reset a password. Occasionally this stuff happens. I mean, our colleagues that we work with professionally regularly deal with customers who have their entire directory dumped in some way through tools like Mimikatz or other things, in which case you kind of got to make everybody reset. Now, to your point, that doesn't mean coming in and showing your ID at the train station. But like, it feels a bit haphazard that all of these systems were taken completely offline for an extended period of time, and all of them seem to have had a complete overhaul, which kind of suggests maybe there had been some neglect or atrophy, perhaps, in the security processes. And I do want to, since I said some negative things for the last minute or two, step back again and on the OT versus IT side. I mean, clearly the trains were operating, which is great. But on top of that, I happen to have some personal experience with that I know I shared with you, which is I spoke at B-Sides London 2023, multi-factor authentication. And while I was there, some people from Transport for London that were responsible for OT security did some presentations and talked a lot about the efforts they put into protecting the train network because of, the concerns over safety and how important the safety of the network is in a modern world, and the adversaries that are out there that could potentially want to disrupt it. And I have to say their professionalism and knowledge was exceptional. So there's clearly a big gap or difference between how if you want, I almost think about it like government, it's like the civilian side or the business side of Transport for London that was impacted in these attacks clearly had a very different process for how they approach things than the side that was responsible for ensuring the safety of passengers. And not only was it unaffected in this case, I have personal interactions with that team to suggest that they are top-notch professionals.
Yeah, which I don't want to say is surprising, but I used to work for a pretty large mining and construction company, and we had OT and IT networks everywhere. I was on the IT side of the fence more often than not. And it's funny because we used to look over the DMZ to the OT network and be like, those people are cowboys. We don't want them to ever plug any device into anything that we run because it is a vulnerable mess. They don't understand security. But from what you're saying in your experience with the people that you've met, the OT team were incredibly professional and did a wonderful job, right?
Yeah, they did. And, I think there's always going to be a gap in judgment between the OT and IT people. I see it in all kinds of environments where I've worked in my career. Both sides don't really respect one another because they're very different goals. I mean, typically in OT networks, people are much more concerned with physical threats than they are with electronic threats. They often underestimate the danger of things like remote access tools and those types of things. And at least the folks that I dealt with at TFL or met at TFL, their OT people had deep backgrounds in IT security. They understood that part not just the switches and lights and signals and stuff that are often thought of in those situations. So that was why I commended them so much. But I mean, we could probably do a whole episode on what OT people think of IT people and what IT people think of OT people, because they're just different environments, right? And the risks are different, right? I mean, the OT people are worried about high pressure things exploding and trains crashing into cars, or like all kinds of things that could cause mass danger. Whereas in IT, it's like, oh, my files got encrypted. Wah.
Yeah, well, which is fair. You know what? Actually, let's save that for another day because yeah, I've got a bit of experience there with tunnel boring machines and mining networks and everything else. But to go back to the 30,000 employee resets, I just want to loop around. At that point, when there was a decision made to reset 30,000 employees' passwords, at that stage, the impact was known. So systems were offline. The public statement said that only 5,000 people's data was accessed, including names, contact details, addresses, some bank account numbers. But at that point, you would look at that and say, well, the impact's relatively low. We've arrested the person that's done it, or the authorities have arrested the person that's done it. The 30,000 employees reset is probably a little bit overkill. But I'm sure, well, I'd like to think that TFL have learnt from this and have now got a playbook in their incident response plan that has something along the lines of like determine impact. And then this is the path that would go through before trying to ask 30,000 people to come into a train station or an office to reset their password. So there's plenty of lessons learnt there from that perspective as well.
Well, 30 million pounds later, this is an expensive lesson to learn. And like, I think there are a lot of, I mean, the whole reason we talked about this is not so much to try to get into the weeds about every specific thing that TFL has done, but there's some interesting lessons here, right? And that's one of them. I mean, having a detailed plan for identifying what's been impacted to reduce the impact. And I don't know what happened in this incident from the inside, but what I can say is I've seen this playbook many times before in other incidents that I've been involved in, which is this might be being used as an excuse to overhaul the network. And you and I discussed this in an earlier episode about the city of Atlanta and their very high cost of their incident as well, which is, gosh, we didn't have the segmentation that we should have had in our network, which would have allowed us to isolate this one thing from these other things and minimize the impact of this incident. We maybe didn't have the most modern tools to do the forensics. Maybe we didn't have our XDR solution in place that allowed us to quickly determine what systems were impacted, what data might have been accessed, etc. This could also be an exercise in forklift upgrading the entire security posture of the network. And I think that, I hope that is the outcome for taxpayers and riders of transit in London who, ultimately are paying for these services, which is the whole thing modernized and advanced itself several steps forward through this process. And maybe I'm being optimistic.
Yeah, I don't think you're being optimistic. So, from what I read, there was £5 million of spend of incident response, investigation, and remedial cybersecurity measures in the 3 months after the attack. But then they wrote down $30 million of losses for the actual incident. Now, there's no breakdown of it, which is disappointing. I actually think, considering its critical infrastructure, the public deserve answers. But they haven't broke down where the additional £25 million has gone. But you would assume that there was a lot of re-architecture and things in place. One thing that I do find interesting, though, is, like, from what we can tell, reading between the lines, is people's information was accessed. It was likely a payment system, but it looks like they ripped everything offline as part of that. So as you said, like, I don't know why you would take offline APIs that are powering other applications if it's a payment industry or it's a payment gateway breach, that kind of thing. So I do find that incredibly perplexing in general of why they just seem to take so many services offline. And then they haven't broken down the spend that came with that as they slowly brought it back online as well. But again, £5 million, that's a lot of money to spend on a single teenager's attack on Transport for London.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with any of that necessarily, but I think that there's phases of your recovery. And in the first phase, the taking everything offline is often prudent. I just don't know how compromised I really was. The safe thing to do is just shut her all down. This case, I call it out more because it was more than 90 days that most of it was down.
Yeah.
That seems like an exceedingly long time to not know what happened. And I think they did know what happened because the response seems to have been quite competent, to be fair, aside from this shutting down massive parts for an extended period of time. But there's a lot of lessons to be learned here. I think there's comms lessons to be learned about frequent, honest, open updates and transparency and how you communicate about incidents. And I don't have any answers for the million plus people that were impacted by not being able to get their discounted transit cards renewed or issued, and all kinds of other things that go along with that. That's a complicated, ugly situation. But there were even impacts outside of TFL because of this, which we haven't talked about yet. That I was going to mention briefly before we wrap up. But there was a program called Oval that was intended to help systems outside of, so if you're on London Transit, you can use the Oyster card, of course, and also you mentioned tap to pay with your Visa, MasterCard, American Express, etc. But that system wasn't implemented in many of the surrounding communities, and so towns like Windsor, famous for, of course, the Windsor Castle where the king officially resides, or these kinds of things, they were going to be doing the IT implementation of these payment systems there. That program was supposed to roll out in September of 2024 and has been sort of indefinitely delayed from what I can tell, and is still not implemented. So there was impacts there. But the weirder one to me was that the City of London, the mayor's office of the City of London, apparently had contracted out their IT services to the train authority. I don't know. I'm not sure what weird government thing goes on for that to happen, but that was the case. And so even the mayor of London's office was offline during much of this attack due to this disruption and them providing outsourced IT services to other parts of the government. So this was a deeply complicated one, and I think the lessons I really wanted to leave our listeners with, I guess the biggest one is disaster recovery is important, and having a detailed plan and having some segmentation so you don't have such a widespread impact when these events occur should be a very high priority for your planning. And the other side is the success here, which is that the OT network wasn't impacted, is great news. And other organizations that have an IT and an OT function should be looking to have similar outcomes when it comes to public safety.
Yeah, and network segmentation isn't too difficult anymore. Like once upon a time, maybe you would call it a dark art, but using cases like this as well to justify the segmentation, and having been there before on both the OT and primarily the IT side of things, the amount of times that there's a management request to be like, hey, can you punch a hole in the firewall so we can access these monitoring systems on this device for this person in finance or this person in whatever department in maintenance, for example. And sometimes it's really difficult to actually turn around to management and say, well, no, because they're the people that pay the bills and they're the ones that are in charge. But using case studies like this tells a really good story to be like, well, look, we have direct segmentation. They're physically separated, not just on a separate VLAN. And that means that we can continue our operations as required on a segmented network that ideally isn't on the internet in a lot of cases. But that means that, if that person wants to access a monitoring system from their office, we're going to need to put a device that's only connected to that OT network, say in their office. It's a little bit more spend, it's a little bit less convenient, but at least you're keeping that segmentation in place. So, mission critical systems, so to speak, or critical systems, so to speak, remain protected and online during an attack. And then, IT, let it operate separately and keep those separate. it's a really valuable lesson. And when it comes to talking to management about these, often IT doesn't have credibility, but sharing stories, sharing notes, and saying, well, your Transport for London is our case study in this instance of why we don't want a 17-year-old to accidentally end up in an OT network that controls the water for a town, or the buses for a town, or the trains for a town. So let's keep them physically separated. So tell the story, get management buy-in, and get them to understand the risks.
Feels like an ounce of prevention, a pound of cure situation. I talked to you earlier today about a flood in my building and some frustrations I had about that, where if we had all spent a bit of money, we could have prevented a very large thing from happening that impacted everybody. And instead, people don't want to do that, goes the other way. And I'm looking at my desk right now, and I've within eyesight, I think I can see 6 laptops. So having a separate system is not that big of a challenge. Now I realize I work in IT and research, and I've been working in my job forever, and I have some old laptops I get to use for secondary purposes when they're not useful to IT anymore. But like that $1,000 secondary system to keep those things separate is a small price to pay compared to a £30 million incident.
Absolutely. Now, I guess to close out, just to mention, 17-year-old was arrested for this under the Computer Misuse Act. Pretty serious crime to be convicted of. I was trying to figure out the exact outcome. Nothing's been announced yet. We don't know what's going to happen to this individual. It's been very quiet since the arrest. The last article I could find on it was around about September. But you could face up to 14 years in prison, depending on the severity of the attack and the impact. So, we've all played with cybersecurity before. Maybe we've done things that we shouldn't have done before. But if you're a teenager, you've stumbled into TFL, I wish this person the best, honestly. I don't think they deserve to spend 14 years in prison for this attack. I think they've made a mistake. I hope they were forthcoming with information and we discover more about this down the track. But it was quite a serious crime for a 17-year-old to commit.
Oh, down the track. That was a bad segue there, Ben. But I would say if you want to hack a train network, you should hack the model train network at B-Sides London, if it's there again next year, or at DEF CON, where we get to play with hacking voting systems and hacking cars and hacking airplanes and hacking this stuff. And if you've got young people around you that are interested in exploring this stuff, let's channel their energies in those directions where it's incredibly a positive outcome. And I do wish the perpetrator the best. I suspect they just had a very poor judgment and hopefully have learned a very important lesson. On that, I'll wrap up this episode of Security Take Two. As usual, you can find us, you can find our podcast on YouTube at youtube.com/@securitytake2 spelled out. Our website is securitytake2.com, and you can email us any feedback you have at hosts@securitytake2.com. And we have a Reddit too, right, Benny?
We certainly do. So if you go to reddit.com/r/securitytake2, you can find the show notes and the link to the episode there. And of course, if you've ever got any questions or want to create discussion, you can do that there as well.